The porch still carried the faint scent of lilacs, a gentle reminder of warmer days and simpler times when the house was alive with laughter and hope. I lingered for a moment, inhaling deeply, as if the scent might somehow shield me from the storm gathering inside. Approaching the door, I hoped to find a moment of understanding with Claire, my daughter, the one I had devoted my life to. But the moment the door opened and I caught sight of her face, all hope crouched silently in the shadows. Her eyes, once warm and full of childish trust, now blazed with something cold and unrecognizable. "Go away," she snapped, the fury in her voice slicing through years of patience and sacrifice. "Or I'll call the police." Those words landed like a fist to the chest. The daughter I had raised, who had clung to my side in childhood, who I'd carried through every hardship, now rejected me outright. I tasted a bitter knot in my throat, struggling to master the shock that surged through me. The house I built for them, every nail hammered with loving hands, every brick laid with a dream for her future, felt alien today, a fortress that had closed against me. "Claire," I said softly, striving to keep my voice steady, "I'm here to talk about things important to both of us." She didn't flinch from the harshness in her eyes. "There's nothing to talk about. Stay out of my way, or else." The threat was sharp and final, leaving no room for pleading or explanation. I stood frozen, the echoes of those words rattling around inside me. Years of endless dedication, the silent nights working overtime to cover tuition, the sacrifices stretched thin over decades, all ignored and dismissed as if meaningless. Each memory was a shard of glass pressed against my chest, and yet I forced myself to remain calm, to hold back the tide of hurt beneath the surface. I thought back to the nights spent poring over bills to ensure she could attend college, the days when I pushed through exhaustion to keep the household afloat when emergencies struck unexpectedly. I had never asked for thanks. My love was quiet, woven into every detail of our life. Yet now, that love was met with bitterness and disdain, a painful reminder that, sometimes, devotion is invisible until it is challenged. As the cold descended inside me, I realized that my presence was no longer welcomed in the house I had built. The silence that hung between us roared louder than any argument. There was no place left for me here. I turned away slowly, letting my eyes rest once more on the home's familiar lines. The roof worn by time, the windows that caught the dying sunlight. This was the place where we had dreamed of happiness. Now it was a silent witness to a fracture I couldn't yet repair. The creak of the gate closing behind me was a quiet farewell to a chapter of my life I never wanted to end this way. Beneath the sorrow and rejection, a resolve began to simmer. Though I stepped back into fading shadows, a small fire ignited within, a promise that I would not let this betrayal define me. This was not the conclusion of our story. It was only the first painful gesture in a long reckoning. And I was ready to face it, armed no longer with hope alone, but with the quiet strength of a man who knows what it means to build and what it takes to rebuild. The silence that settled over my empty house felt heavier than any burden I had carried before. I sank into my worn armchair, the fabric softened by years of daily use, and let my mind wander back through all those years. Years filled with unseen sacrifices that had, until now, been taken for granted. Memories unfolded, vivid and weighty, like blueprints meticulously sketched out over a lifetime. I thought first of the day Claire was accepted into college, the pride in my chest mixed with an undercurrent of anxiety. The tuition alone was a mountain, one that loomed over my modest savings like a shadow. Still, I worked extra hours, sometimes through nights, pushing my hands to the limit. I remember coming home exhausted yet determined, convinced that every penny squeezed out of restraint was a brick in the foundation of her future. Those nights were long and lonely, but the thought of her succeeding kept me going. Then there was the house itself. The house Maria and I had dreamed about, the roof under which Claire grew up. It was more than just shelter. It was a promise of stability. I recalled rolling out blueprints on the old kitchen table, sketching and recalculating costs with a patient hand. Each beam, each floorboard was a tangible piece of hope, hammered and nailed together with hope and sacrifice. I remember touching the rough beams in the early stages of construction, imagining the laughter and warmth that would fill the space. Now, looking at that same house through the lens of Claire's rejection, it seemed less a sanctuary and more a symbol of my invisibility. I went back even further in time to the countless nights spent fixing leaks, managing unexpected expenses, and balancing bills with the precision I had learned as a civil engineer. Every mundane task was a silent act of love, each one a patchwork stitch holding the fabric of our family together. I never needed thanks. Fulfillment came from knowing that Claire's life was steadier, safer, because of these sacrifices. Yet, all those years of devotion felt erased, the hard work undone in moments by cold disdain. Claire's dismissive words echoed in my mind, a sharp contrast to the love that had motivated every sleepless night and every penny spent. It was as if I had built a monument in the sand that the tide now cruelly reclaimed. I allowed myself that sting of sorrow, that fierce ache of betrayal, but it quickly gave way to a deeper, more painful clarity. I saw now that love alone was not enough. My sacrifices had been met with entitlement. The daughter I'd nurtured was no longer the child I'd known. Greed and impatience had taken root where once there had been gratitude and respect. I struggled to understand her perspective, to see beyond the pain. Had she grown impatient with the pace of my provision? Did she believe her inheritance was owed, no questions asked, regardless of effort or respect? These questions circled in my mind unrelentingly, shattering comforting illusions I'd long held about family loyalty. Yet amidst the growing bitterness, a new resolve began to stir, quieted at first, but undeniable. My training as an engineer had taught me to analyze, to anticipate challenges, and to devise solutions. This situation was no different. The years of careful planning that had guided me to build a life for my family would now fuel a different kind of strategy, not born out of hope alone, but now fortified with resolve. Maria had always reminded me that true strength requires more than patience. It demands action, even when that action is difficult and personal. Reminded of her voice, I understood that I could no longer remain passive. This was not a surrender. This was a moment to reclaim my dignity and protect what was mine. I pulled out an old notebook, weathered and dog-eared from years of careful record-keeping. Flipping through pages filled with financial statements and housing plans, I traced the contours of my invisible labor. Mortgages, property values, emergency funds carefully built and maintained. These figures were more than numbers. They were silent witness to my lifelong commitment. I also revisited past tensions, subtle dismissals, sharp retorts I'd once smoothed over, distances once brushed off as temporary. Those moments painted a clear picture now, a pattern of growing disrespect I could no longer ignore. This awareness was painful but necessary. I realized that my role could no longer be the quiet provider overshadowed by contempt. It was time to move from silent endurance to calculated action. The pain of betrayal sharpened my focus, transforming sorrow into determination. My mind began mapping out the next steps, a plan precise and unwavering, designed to safeguard what was rightfully mine and to impart a lesson in respect and consequences. The home and estate I had poured my life into would be the instruments of this reckoning, wielded not with anger but with steady resolve. As the evening deepened and shadows lengthened, I rose from my chair with a steadiness I hadn't felt in days. The bitterness lodged in my heart was tempered by clarity and purpose. Though the coming road would be difficult and uncertain, it was mine to walk, and I would not falter. Tonight, I embraced the painful truth without surrendering to it. This was not an end, but a beginning, the genesis of a story where I was no longer a victim, but a man reclaiming his power. Built patiently over years, my resolve now stood like the strongest foundation, ready to support the rebuild of a life defined not by betrayal, but by unwavering endurance and quiet strength. In the weeks that unfolded, a quiet storm brewed beneath my calm exterior, a storm fueled not by rage, but by the steady rise of determination. The sharp sting of betrayal was still palpable, but it no longer paralyzed me. Instead, it became the impetus to shift from the passive man I once was into a careful and unyielding strategist. I knew that justice would not come from impulsive actions or heated confrontations. It demanded patience, clarity, and a relentless commitment to precision. I began by immersing myself in the records that tied our family's assets together. The house, the estate, the mortgages, tax records, insurance policies, all of it. Years of my life have been wrapped in these papers, a tapestry of sacrifices woven through meticulous budgeting and planning. My years as a civil engineer trained me to read between the lines, to find structure where others saw chaos. I cross-checked signatures and deadlines, mapped ownership interests, and scrutinized the fine print. Each figure, each clause held significance, some that I could turn to my advantage, others that warned of rising risks. Claire and her husband had long relied on my steady hand to manage the financial foundations of our family. Their arrogance masked their dependence, but I saw through it now with unflinching clarity. I refused to let rash emotion dictate my next steps. Instead, I concealed my growing resolve behind layers of silence. I became a collector of data, weaving together economic forces, legal statutes, and family dynamics into a plan, deliberate and unbreakable. I reached out to trusted allies who could help me see the full landscape. Harold, my longtime friend and a seasoned realtor, spoke plainly about the real estate market's fluctuations. "Timing is everything," he said during our meeting, his voice steady and pragmatic. Together, we discussed potential buyers, market trends, and the best strategies to maximize the home's value. Harold's experience grounded my ideas in reality, shaping the plan that had only been a flicker into a solid outline. Anne, the attorney I had relied on for years, waded through documents with thoroughness and discretion. She listened as I laid bare the family discord, the financial complexities, and the urgency of reclaiming control. With each conversation, my strategy gained sharp edges: legal protections, procedural steps, safeguards. Anne made sure I understood the full power of my rights and the traps I had to avoid. Her quiet confidence bolstered my own. As days passed, I grew increasingly attuned not only to financial details, but to the subtle undercurrents of Claire's behavior. I noted the sharpness of her tone in fleeting conversations, the dismissive glances exchanged between her and her husband. Their contempt was palpable, almost gleeful in its brazenness. But I met it with the calm I had never known before, carefully controlled replies and silence where anger might have stirred. I used absence of emotion as armor, refusing to lower myself to their level. My resolve crystallized fully one afternoon when a formal letter arrived, requesting that I grant Claire and her husband power of attorney over key financial assets, moves designed not just to sideline me, but to seize control. I stared at the document, the weight of its implications pressing heavily. It was a declaration of war disguised as administrative formality. Rather than reacting in anger, I collected every shred of evidence I could find. I compiled a dossier: records of mortgage payments, bank statements showing discrepancies, letters ignored, expenses paid without acknowledgement. This dossier was not only proof, it was the foundation of my countermeasure. In private moments, I recalled Claire's scornful expressions, her impatience, her entitlement. I no longer saw only my daughter, but the antagonist standing defiantly before me. Yet, anger was a tool I would not wield. Restraint was far more potent. I became a silent sentinel, ready for the battles ahead. Each rolling thought was an exercise in precision. How would this next conversation unfold? Which arguments would dismantle their arrogance? I rehearsed my words to ensure control, to maintain authority without allowing emotion its foothold. This was a chess game, with moves planned carefully and each piece in position to strike when the moment came. The memories of sacrifices I had quietly shouldered came into sharper focus. The extra hours worked to cover tuition, the nights spent patching the house after storms, the steady support that formed the backbone of their privileged existence. These were no longer just painful recollections, but the moral weight that demanded respect and reparation. The road ahead was steep and unpredictable, but I walked it with newfound confidence. I was not the broken, ignored man from weeks ago. I had become a calculated force, wielding knowledge and patience as my weapons and protecting myself with logic and clarity. This transition was neither sudden nor easy. It grew from the ashes of betrayal into a new identity, no longer a silent victim, but the architect of a reckoning defined by endurance, intellect, and resolve. Late into the quiet hours, I began to draft a blueprint not just for reclaiming property or financial control, but for restoring self-respect and imposing consequences on those who had turned their backs so casually. I was no longer seeking forgiveness or reconciliation. I was preparing for justice, a justice measured and deliberate, delivered without haste, but with undeniable strength. I recognized then that this was not merely a family issue, but a profound reckoning of dignity and power. The journey was mine to command, and I was ready. The house had always stood as an emblem of my efforts, a fortress of our family's history, built with more than bricks and mortar, but with years of labor, quiet sacrifice, and dreams. Now it would become the centerpiece of a reckoning I'd meticulously planned. I knew that confronting Claire directly would only serve to escalate tensions without resolving anything. I needed facts, strategy, and allies beyond my own resolve. With the precision ingrained by decades as a civil engineer, I began to map out every detail of my plan. First, I needed comprehensive understanding. I dug deep into the real estate market trends, observing invisible currents that influenced property values and the timing for selling. I gathered spreadsheets, sales reports, and projections, data that transformed the abstract idea of selling the house into a concrete possibility ripe with leverage. A meeting with Harold was pivotal. I met him at his modest office, walls lined with photos of sold properties and neighborhood maps. His experience lent gravity to my purpose. This market, he said, is volatile but promising if timed right. A well-priced listing could draw significant interest, and given the house's pedigree, it holds value that any buyer would recognize. Hearing this lifted the vague notions swirling in my mind into a definitive course. Together, we strategized the best timing to put the home on the market, considering seasonal peaks and regional developments. We discussed the logistics of staging and marketing, each step a quiet blade turning in my plan. Harold's steady voice grounded my ideas. Every detail, down to the small repairs and updates that would maximize appeal, mattered. Meanwhile, Anne's involvement deepened. Her office was a sanctuary of calm order, piles of legal texts and contracts arranged with care. She reviewed every document, deeds, mortgages, tax records, with both the thoroughness of a jurist and the sensitivity of someone who understood how tangled family disputes could become. She clarified the limitations and strengths of my position, especially regarding the rights embedded in the property title and financial agreements. Anne laid out the tools available: escrow arrangements, notices of intent, and legal protections designed to shield me from impulsive actions by Claire and her spouse. Each suggestion was another stone in the bulwark I was constructing, designed to protect not just assets, but the dignity I refused to surrender. Behind the scenes, I reached out discreetly to trusted acquaintances, a few old friends in the banking and legal sectors, men and women who respected integrity and discretion. Their knowledge rounded out my understanding of potential pitfalls and tactical opportunities, discreetly steering me clear of traps others had fallen into in similar conflicts. Night after night, I refined the nuances of my plan. The house was no longer simply a home or a symbol of past joys. It was a lever to restore balance. Each action had to be flawless, calculated to exert pressure without provoking unnecessary hostility. My approach was not about vengeance, but about reclaiming rightful control and dignity through patient, deliberate moves. Throughout this time, I maintained a facade of calm determinism in my dealings with Claire and her husband. Their arrogance was a paper tiger, intimidating to some, but transparently brittle to a man with my resolve. I parried their snide remarks and veiled threats with cool replies and selective listening, never giving away the extent of my preparations. I was careful to avoid giving them any grounds to accuse me of impulsiveness or emotional instability, mistakes that could weaken my position legally or socially. Instead, I let my silence speak volumes, an unyielding presence measured in quiet steps rather than loud words. An essential part of my strategy involved mobilizing evidence, not just financial documents, but a paper trail of the abuses and manipulations that had marred our family relationships. I collected records of unpaid bills, unauthorized withdrawals, and mismanaged funds. These pieces would not only justify my actions, but expose the depth of their disrespect and recklessness. Simultaneously, I took notes on every interaction, every aggressive gesture and dismissal. These would serve as a record confirming the pattern of contempt and entitlement that had fractured our family's foundation. This meticulous documentation was necessary to maintain credibility in any legal or social contest that lay ahead. I also discovered early signs of panic in Claire and her husband. The way they whispered in corners, the sudden urgency with which they approached legal advisors themselves, the increased tension during family meetings. Their bravado gave way to frantic defenses, the armor of entitlement beginning to crack under the weight of my silent counterattack. Throughout these weeks, I felt the paradox of my journey, the pride in my careful engineering of a plan, tempered with the sorrow of how far this path had led me from the father I once was. But sorrow was no longer the master. Determination was. Each calculated step forward was a reassertion of dignity stolen from me. I was no longer a man waiting for forgiveness or reconciliation. The past was too fractured for that. Instead, I was an architect of resolution, building a future where respect was mandatory and arrogance found its boundaries. At times, I paused and studied the house itself. The windows catching the late afternoon sun, the garden shadowed by gentle trees. This had been built upon hopes and countless quiet sacrifices. Now it was the fulcrum of my quiet revolution, a testament to the unyielding spirit of a man wronged but not defeated. I knew that when the time came to act, everything had to be flawless. The timing, the presentation, the legal framework supporting the sale. This would be my statement, a silent but decisive message that intention and endurance could overcome disrespect and dismissal. Through every phase of planning, I grounded myself in the knowledge that this was a war waged with intellect and patience rather than brute force. It was the calculated precision of an engineer who knew that every tiny adjustment contributed to the stability or collapse of an entire structure. I spent considerable time analyzing the family estate's financial details, the mortgage terms, liens, and obligations, and prepared myself to enforce payment suspensions if necessary. I knew that withholding the mortgage payments would shock Claire and her husband, severing the financial lifeline they had taken for granted. It was a negotiation tactic as old as property law itself, applying pressure where it hurts, but silently and effectively. Each element was part of a slowly tightening web meant to assert my rights and reveal the cost of their disrespect. These actions, though seemingly procedural, carried immense symbolic weight.
The house that was once a sanctuary was becoming the battleground where justice would be served not by words, but by undeniable consequence. Though the plan's scale was immense, I maintained my routine, careful not to let the weight of it crush the quiet man inside me who had long found solace in small moments. Early morning coffee, the soft turning of well-worn pages, the gentle hum of evening settling over the world.
I understood this fight would be protracted and could leave scars not just on relationships, but on my own soul. Yet I welcomed this challenge, for it was born of necessity. I was no longer willing to let betrayal define me, nor would I allow arrogance to pave its own path unchecked. Every consideration, every detail was part of a grand design, built not on impulse nor on fury, but on the enduring strength of a man who had spent a lifetime learning how to build well and now how to dismantle with care. In quiet moments, I would envision the eventual outcome. Claire and her spouse confronted with the irreversible changes, their entitlement stripped by a plan both inevitability and righteous. And as the house's silhouette faded into the twilight, I felt, for the first time in many months, a surge of calm satisfaction. The house would be sold, the estate recalibrated, and I would reclaim my dignity, not with shouting and recrimination, but through the unyielding power of resolve and the methodical precision of a man who never gave up. Ocorreu erro inesperado. Erro código 400. Error. Mensagem Can't add messages to thread 9YXBEMHQCDRO while run 2WI3QHGAMGNKPMXBIKVKIK. The day I chose for the meeting was heavy with a tension that had been growing for months, an unseen weight pressing on every corner of the house we once called home. We gathered in the living room, the air thick with unspoken accusations and fading hopes. Claire and her husband sat opposite me, faces guarded yet betraying an undercurrent of unease and defiance. The house, with its peeling paint and quiet creaks, bore witness to what would be the critical turning point of our fractured family saga. I organized the evidence before them in neat stacks, financial records, bank statements, payment histories meticulously compiled to show the undeniable truth. Loans missed, payments delayed, fiduciary duties ignored. It was a ledger of neglect. But this confrontation was never about shaming. It was about clarity, accountability, and the assertion of justice. My voice, calm but firm, guided the narrative. I spoke of the sacrifices too long hidden, the tuition paid with personal savings drained dry, the countless nights spent repairing, patching, and tending to the house to keep it a sanctuary from the world's harshness. I detailed the quiet years of enduring stress, silence masking the fatigue, and the endurance it took to provide stability in the face of growing disregard. I did not speak with bitterness, but with a measured resolve that spoke of a man finally standing firm. Each fact laid bare was a brick in the foundation of a claim that was both legal and moral. My commitment was unshaken, my purpose clear. Claire's features twitched between indignation and dawning realization. Her husband's attempts to interject were met with my steady gaze, each defense carefully dismantled by the unassailable facts before us. The room filled with an uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by the turning of pages and the ticking of the old clock hanging on the wall. I reminded them that family bonds, even those forged by blood, could not substitute for respect and responsibility. Their entitlement, once taken for granted, needed to be weighed against the sacrifices that had sustained them. Where they had failed in duty, consequences were not merely appropriate, but necessary. As the hours wore on, their bravado diminished, replaced by a tentative acknowledgement of the realities we faced. The harshness of the truth is often its own punishment, and I watched as the facades they wore crumbled before the steady light of accountability. Though firm, I maintained a voice of reconciliation. My aim was not to sever ties completely, but reignite a sense of responsibility and mutual respect. It was an olive branch woven in the tough fabric of reality, respect and honesty as the new foundation upon which we could, perhaps, rebuild. When they left, the silence was heavier, imbued with the weight of unspoken admissions. The house breathed in the return of slowed grief and a tentative hope that this reckoning might become a beginning. I sat alone afterward, heart pounding yet unburdened by rage. The confrontation marked a shift. I was no longer a silent victim, but a man who had reclaimed his voice and standing through patience and unwavering proof. In the following days, legal processes advanced with measured diligence. I found solace not just in the progress, but in the quiet restoration of my self-respect. Justice, I realized, is paradoxical. It cuts deep even as it heals, demanding endurance in exchange for a hard-won peace. The trauma of fractured family ties gave way slowly to the potential for transformation, rooted in truth and accountability. Though the wounds ran deep, they were met with honesty rather than denial. My hope had evolved, not towards naive restoration, but meaningful acknowledgement and change. As weeks slipped by, I drew strength from the integrity that had guided me all these years. Memories of sacrifice no longer wounded me. Instead, they served as pillars reinforcing my resolve. This was not conquest, but principled standing. I was guardian to a justice wrought from pain, not anger, winning through perseverance rather than conflict. The journey was arduous, marked by setbacks and small victories alike. Yet rising from it all was the profound knowledge that dignity, once overshadowed by betrayal, could be restored. When final agreements were signed and ownership shifted, a complex peace settled in. The house, that silent witness to family stories, passed into new hands. I stood firm, free at last from shadows cast by ingratitude. From the pain of betrayal, I emerged transformed, not broken but strengthened, not defeated but empowered. I had faced arrogance with calm endurance and reclaimed my rightful place. In the quiet aftermath, peace came, complicated, bittersweet, but real, illuminated not by triumphalism, but by justice patiently restored. The house was gone now, sold and walked away from, yet its absence spoke louder than any walls ever could. The echoes of years lost to bitterness and betrayal lingered, but in their place arose a profound stillness, a quiet space I had long sought but never dared fully envision. Alone, in a smaller apartment that felt more like refuge than retreat, I found myself reflecting not just on what had been taken, but what I had gained. Peace was not a thunderous celebration. It was a delicate, measured sunrise, gradual, sometimes hesitant, but undeniably real. Preserve the original language of the text, embraced instead by the simple rhythms I had neglected for too long. The scent of morning coffee, the gentle light through the window, the soft rustle of pages as I revisited old books. These were the moments that stitched together a new kind of contentment. In the evenings, when the world outside quieted and shadows lengthened, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the journey behind me, the ache of sacrifice, the sting of rejection, the unyielding resolve that had guided me forward. It was a complex tapestry of emotions, woven tightly with threads of pain and strength. I thought often of Maria, my late wife, whose steady voice had once been my compass. She had believed in patience and fortitude, in quiet strength. It was her memory that sustained me through the darkest nights, reminding me that dignity is not bought with loud words, but earned in silent perseverance. Visiting the neighborhood where our home once stood was bittersweet. The familiar streets, the worn benches, the faded mailbox, I walked them with a mixture of loss and acceptance. The house was no longer there, but the foundation I had laid in my heart remained unshaken. I understood now that home is not merely a place of bricks and mortar, but a sanctuary found in steadfastness and self-respect. My relationship with Claire remained fractured, but the sharp edges had softened. Distance and time had tempered bitterness into something quieter. Perhaps regret, perhaps understanding too late. I no longer sought to mend what had been broken beyond repair. Instead, I sought peace within myself, and in that pursuit I found freedom. For years I had measured life by sacrifice and duty, often forgetting the necessity of self-care. This chapter was different. I embraced solitude not as loneliness, but as space to rediscover parts of myself lost in the struggle. Memories of youth,
Forgotten dreams, and the simple joy of quiet reflection. My daily routines, once carved out of necessity to support others, became rituals of renewal. Long walks in the park, the slow crafting of woodwork in a small workshop, letters to old friends once left unspoken. Each act was a reclaiming of time and spirit, a gentle rebellion against years of invisibility. Though scars remained, they no longer defined me. They were reminders of battles fought and lessons learned, proof that strength often grows from pain. I carried those marks not with shame, but with a quiet pride that only comes from honest adversity. The future, once a vague shadow, grew clearer with each passing day. It was no longer bound to the expectations of others, but shaped by my own desires and wisdom. In the freedom of choice, I found a new kind of hope, not loud or brash, but steady and profound. In this newfound clarity, I understood that justice had taken many forms, not only in reclaiming my property and rights, but in reclaiming myself. It was a victory built not on vengeance, but on the unwavering power of resolve, patient, deliberate, and ultimately liberating. As I sat by the window one evening, watching the sky fade from gold to deep indigo, I felt a calmness that had eluded me for too long. The distant sounds of life, children playing, neighbors chatting, reminded me that the world moves on, inviting those willing to embrace it anew. I whispered a final thought into the twilight. In losing their claim over me, I finally found freedom, earned not by violence, but by the unyielding power of resolve. And with that, I closed my eyes, ready to live the next chapter on my own terms.